Thank you and welcome to Advocacy in a Time of Pandemic, Polarity, and Insecurity, How to Reach Decision Makers and How to Be Effective. This session is sponsored by Friends of Libraries in Oklahoma, or FOLIO. And as we all know, this past year, the pandemic, political polarization, and the economic slump we have all experienced changed the advocacy situation for libraries. And the way we typically make contact has changed. Our communities face new challenges. Some challenges aren't new, but have been even more exposed given the events of last year, and really a fresh message is really needed. On top of everything else, Oklahoma faced additional challenges with ice storms and a devastating record-breaking blizzard. So these events have severely impacted library services across the state, as well as the incomes of library employees and the ability of friends groups to provide their usual fundraising and volunteer support services to their library. So the main takeaway from the session today is to really gain an understanding of how the unique events since early 2020 have modified the playing field for advocates, government officials, and other community leaders. We hope that you'll learn today how to advocate effectively and leave with new skills that will result in action. We've invited some community leaders from across Oklahoma, experienced advocates, to share advice on how to be effective library advocates and what they've learned over the past year in the current state of our world. So if you attend in person, we will have our panelists and we will have some time for Q&A and you can actively engage with them. And I'm sure you will want to because we have an amazing group of people lined up today to talk with us. So today with us, I am proud to share that we have Dr. April Grace, Shawnee Public Schools Superintendent, who has led the district since 2016 and has served as an educator in Oklahoma for more than 30 years. Dr. Grace is currently serving as the Oklahoma Association of School Administrators President, only the second female elected in the 88-year history of the organization and the only one in the past 25 years. She has received a number of awards, including the 2020 State Superintendent's Award for Arts Excellence and the 2019 Oklahoma Administrator Award from Oklahoma School Librarians. She holds a doctorate in educational leadership from the University of Phoenix, a master's degree in secondary school administration from the University of Oklahoma, and a bachelor's degree in science education from the University of Oklahoma. So welcome, Dr. Grace. Mayor Brea Clark was elected as Norman's 60th mayor in 2019 after serving the city for 3 years as Ward 6 councilor. As the youngest female to hold this position, Mayor Clark is committed to living out Norman's motto, building an inclusive community. She serves as the University of Oklahoma's director of the J.C. Penney Leadership Center, which focuses on building and preparing leaders for the diverse and global opportunities presented in the 21st century. She is one of 40 American mayors selected to participate in the Bloomberg Harvard City Leadership Initiative. Brea previously served on the Norman Library Advisory Board, probably her most prestigious role, and is an enthusiastic supporter of libraries. So welcome, Mayor Clark. Brea. Melissa Houston is the founder and principal for 929 Strategies, a public policy consulting firm. Houston is an attorney who has more than 20 years of experience in the front lines of public policy development and implementation in the state of Oklahoma. She has worked extensively in agency operations, regulatory reform, public policy development, legislation and administrative rules, political campaigns, and numerous high-profile litigation matters. Houston attended the University of Oklahoma, where she earned a bachelor's degree in letters and a Juris Doctor. She and her husband, Ben Houston, who is also an attorney, live in Norman with their 2 teenage sons. Welcome, Melissa. While pursuing a Bachelor of Science in Agricultural Business and Economics from Oklahoma State University, James McSpadden began his political career as a member of Brad Henry's successful gubernatorial campaign, which led to a position as a member of Governor Henry's personal staff. McSpadden also served as a staffer for Congressman Dan Boren and Senate President pro tempore Mike Morgan before joining McSpadden and Associates in 2004. The latter, a firm founded by James's grandfather, Clem McSpadden, in 1983, laid the foundation for a successful career representing small state-run associations to Fortune 100 companies. Today, McSpadden is active in various capacities for civic and charity organizations, particularly those that benefit rural communities. He resides in Oklahoma City with his wife, Joanna, and their 2 children. So welcome, James. Welcome to all of our panelists, and thank you all for being here today. So now that we've all gotten acquainted, we'll begin our Q&A. And I am going to start with some questions for Melissa as she has to jump off the call early today. So let's start right now. So Melissa, tell us, in the last year, what was the hardest thing you had to advocate for during the pandemic? And what was the hardest thing that was asked of you during the pandemic in your role?
I think, well, thank you for having me and thank you for the opportunity to be here. I think the challenges that I faced were probably the same challenges that everyone else faced. Learning how to live in Zoom was certainly not something that I was familiar with on the beginning. I had to learn how to use Zoom and WebEx and Google Meets and Microsoft Teams. And so every client or constituency that I had, you would use various platforms. And so that was certainly a challenge. Making sure, and again, as everyone, making sure that my internet capacity was such that it would support all of that at the same time that I had two teenage sons at home. So, trying to schedule around when they had their classes versus when I could have meetings and making sure we had the bandwidth in the beginning was a little bit of a challenge. As far as policies, I was probably in a unique position because I'd worked for Homeland Security for almost 10 years. And so I was at the ground level back in 2001 after 9/11 when we developed the foundation of how you respond to a national emergency. And in fact, what many people don't realize is that during Homeland Security, we were actually planning for public health emergencies as well. So the Catastrophic Health Emergency Powers Act, which appeared to everyone to have come out of nowhere, was actually something that we had worked on 20 years ago in preparation for things like this. So I was a little bit more prepared because 20 years ago we had exercised and thought through some of these issues. And so the basic infrastructure was in place for our state and their responses.
That's so fascinating. And that's amazing to think back that far and you had that forethought to think ahead. You just mentioned internet connection. That's something that was really drawn attention to this past year, was that digital divide. And, libraries have been a center for connectivity, but the reality is there really is that issue there of that lack of internet connection for so many people in our country and especially in Oklahoma. So Melissa, can you speak to strategies that we could employ to collectively work together to provide equitable connectivity to our communities?
Well, I definitely think that the Oklahoma legislature has done a good job this year of really being aware of some of the challenges, specifically in the broadband area. And they've passed a number of bills this session to try and bring people together in urban and rural areas and make sure the right people are around the table, stakeholders, companies, et cetera, doing some mapping, some funding. They have a grant program. But I think the other thing that's very important is that the federal government has realized that as well. And so there are unprecedented resources that can be used specifically for broadband at this point in time. Through the American Rescue Plan, there are different pots of money available for broadband. Through agriculture, the USDA has broadband funding. Through education, there's broadband funding. I mean, so from the federal level, there are lots of different pots of money that would allow the state of Oklahoma to hopefully address this issue. But what that's going to take is a statewide strategy of the right people at the table, identifying the problems, mapping out the solutions, and deploying a comprehensive strategy to use these pots of money to address the issue as a whole. That was something we did again years ago with Homeland Security. We were very mindful of the unprecedented pots of federal money that were coming down. And we didn't want to just kind of snow on everyone's lawn and look back 3 years later and say, what did we do? And so we implemented, we brought all the stakeholders together, we built a coalition and we identified the problems and we proposed solutions. And then we just started chipping away with federal resources, state resources, city resources. And I'm proud to say that the things that we designed over 20 years ago, from regional response systems to public safety communications to school security, are actually all still in place to this day. And I attribute a lot of that to having the right people around the table and to having a directed strategy and applying resources to that strategy. So we could do the same thing with broadband.
Dr. Grace, I was curious on your answer for this question. I know that's something that schools, especially this year, obviously saw some disconnect there when we moved to a virtual learning environment. So anything you'd like to add?
Sure. As Melissa mentioned, definitely looking at leveraging those federal dollars that are available, as well as any state funds or partnerships. So for us, it was looking at grant opportunities and partnering with our local community library system. And they had a way to do sort of a mobile unit that could go about. We also had the opportunity then to partner with different providers and use that federal money to then do hotspots and put those out into the community as well and to all of our students. And so I think it's continuing to look forward. As she mentioned, getting the right people at the table. We're talking currently with some partnerships with some entities in the city, our chamber, as well as the city of Shawnee, and looking at how we can leverage some of these new dollars coming in and how do we put in some towers and some things that make sense in some parts of the community to extend some of this connectivity, because we know that some of these things aren't going to go away entirely. And how do we continue to extend these services moving forward?
Absolutely. Mayor Clark, is there anything you want to add from a local government standpoint?
I think they've touched on a couple of things that are very important. One of them being that we have a lot of one-time resources to help kind of shore up that infrastructure issue with broadband. We saw that if you didn't have reliable internet during the stay-at-home orders, you didn't have access to a doctor, you didn't have access to work, you didn't have access to education, and you didn't have access to people. So it's incredibly important that we take care of this. And as Ms. Houston has pointed out, there's lots of groundwork for it. And I don't know about Dr. Grace, but I know here in Norman, we're going to be looking closely to partner with our district as well because of the resources they have also received. So I think it's only room for improvement, and which we all know the problems and have plenty of solutions, but funding is usually the issue. And for once, it's nice to have some real support on that front.
That's great. James, anything you'd like to add? Don't want to leave you out.
Absolutely. So Oklahoma is currently ranked 47th nationally for rural access to broadband. It's a few years old, but in 2017, Oklahoma State did a study, and they found that 30% of households in rural Oklahoma, or in Oklahoma in general, don't have access to broadband. 72% in urban areas and 48% in rural areas have access. Melissa touched on it earlier. There's $42 million worth of incentives in this year's state budget package for broadband providers, mainly focused in rural areas. And on top of that, if President Biden's infrastructure package passes, there's another $100 billion for broadband connectivity with an aim of getting all Americans connected over the next 8 years.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So speaking of those rural communities, our next question is, how do we develop strategies to ensure that underrepresented groups or communities' voices are heard? From the library community, we see that sometimes smaller or more rural libraries don't have as many representatives at the Capitol, for example. So how do we elevate those voices and make sure that everybody has that representation when discussing issues of any kind, but broadband or any kind of advocacy? And Melissa, I'll start with you.
I think the first thing is to have those relationships in place ahead of time. Really, you want to develop your relationship with your local representative as soon as possible. The dirty little secret of the Capitol is that you really can move mountains with a handful of phone calls from an actual constituent. Like, it's not as impactful when a representative gets 100 emails and they're from California or New York, fine. But if they get 5 phone calls from people who can actually vote for them, that are registered voters, that show up and vote, and have those relationships ahead of time, it really can make a huge impact. So having those relationships ahead of time, I think is very important. I also think it's important to identify other partners, you know, in the world that you may be looking for, in the issue that you may be addressing. It's also important to begin with the end in mind of what is it that you're trying to accomplish. Are you trying to accomplish a specific bill passing, or are you trying to accomplish a policy being enacted, or are you trying to win? I mean, there are different strategies depending upon what your actual goal is. You could be advocating for Bill 123, but by the end of the day, Bill 123 may be a completely different bill. If you're advocating for a policy and a policy change, then you have to recognize on the front end that you may need to compromise, that there may be shifting priorities and shifting coalitions that you bring to the table, depending upon how the policy is advancing. So always thinking about kind of what the end goal is very important. I think the final thing to me that's important in that area is to really listen. That is such a lost art at this point in time, but to listen, and sometimes people will react with anger, or they'll react thinking they know what you're going to say. You have to kind of listen past the trauma. You kind of have to listen through the anger to really get at what is the point of view, the perspective, the policy decision, and help move that way. So you really have to listen on multiple levels.
That's such wonderful advice, and something, you know, that we're all, I think, struggling with at this point in time, like you said. James, do you have anything you want to add? I know Melissa shared your secret of having constituents call.
I think now I'm paraphrasing here, but I think what Melissa meant to say was that you should hire a lobbyist to help you with that. But I don't want to put words in her mouth. No, that's exactly right. And I use the rule of 5 to 1. For every 5 conversations I have, 1 constituent phone call is about equal to that. And so getting to know your legislators ahead of time before you're asking for something is critically important. Don't let the first time they get to meet you be when you are asking something of them, because you are already behind. So take the time. That's one thing that I love about representing libraries, is it's this grassroots force out there in Oklahoma and all communities of people who are able, willing, and motivated to sit down and invite their elected officials to their place of work to kind of get to know them. But Melissa touched on most of that already, but I agree.
That's great. Mayor Clark, anything you'd like to add? I know you represent a 3rd largest city in Oklahoma. So how do you make sure that everybody is heard and represented at the table?
I think the first way you do that is build trust. You can't just go there and say, okay, tell me what's on your mind, because it takes time. So it's not an immediate process, and every little step helps, but it does take time. And that trust is crucial if you're really looking to connect and make a difference in their lives. And you also have to reach them where they are. You know, I've experienced this where I have this great program and everyone's going to come and we're going to be an inclusive community, and nobody comes because the trust wasn't there and I didn't reach them where they were at. And so we're actually doing that with vaccine pods right now. We're making it very easy and going to their communities. And when we reach out to parts of the community that kind of distrust the science behind us, we work with leaders within their communities so they don't have to hear it from me. So I think that's incredibly important. And when it comes to making sure voices are heard and amplified, especially in terms of advocacy, tell your story. Phone calls are great, as we've covered, but if you give me an actual story that I can then share with my colleagues about why it makes a difference and how it makes a difference, it's so powerful. So personalize it when you're making the phone call.
That's great. Thank you. And Melissa, I know you need to hop off, so feel free whenever. You're welcome to stay as long as you'd like, but if you need to jump off, we completely understand. So thank you for being here, and thanks for your time.
I have a few more minutes, so I'll hang out for.
Well, welcome to stick around. Dr. Grace, anything you'd like to add in terms of underrepresented groups and rural communities?
I would echo what they said, build the relationships early, keep them ongoing. And I would say try to invite them to have sort of legislative coffees or those type of activities in the rural communities, as well as visit them at the Capitol and just be there to introduce yourself and visit them. I think sometimes it's important to remind everyone, we need to let people know too what we're for, not just what we're against. We seem to be really good always about letting people know what we're against, and sometimes not so much about what we're for. And I think for legislators and lawmakers, that sometimes gets a little tiring to only hear what we're against. So talking about some of the things we're for, and to Mayor Clark's point, to personalizing, telling our stories often and telling them well.
That's great. And I'll give a mid-session plug for OLA attendees. You can go to the OLA website. They're actually collecting library stories on the website. So you can share that, and then those stories are shared out as part of advocacy committee. So that's a great way to have your story be told. All right, so we'll circle back to this question for everyone else. If you wanted to share, what was the hardest thing you had to advocate for during the pandemic, and what was the hardest thing that was asked of you? Mayor Clark, I'm gonna start with you. I'm sure there's something on your mind from the last year that you were asked to do.
Oh man, so how long do I have? No, I'm kidding. So the hardest thing I had to advocate for, it was taking action and getting people to take it seriously. I'm always boggled by the question of, how did you know to act? I'm like, do you live in a bubble? Did you like literally see what was coming? Like, we had time. And so we took the first action in the state, which I think helped other cities and even the governor take some action, which in turn, I believe, saved lives. And so the hardest thing to advocate for at the beginning was the lockdown, hands down. It's very difficult. It took a physical health crisis and quickly doubled it with a mental health crisis. So at one point, how long do we stay closed when the police department reports that domestic violence calls are increasing, child abuse calls are increasing, suicide calls are increasing? So that was very difficult. And then towards the end, when we knew more about what we were dealing with, masks were the answer. So that was challenging, but Norman led the way with the first mask mandate as well, and we were the last ones to get rid of it. So if anyone's watching, I have zero regrets about any decision that I've made, in case you were curious. So the hardest thing that I was asked to do, not give up, communicate constantly. And oddly enough, for those of you that are not aware, Norman counselors and mayor, we make $100 a month to serve the third largest city in the state of Oklahoma. And it's based on meeting attendance. So when the pandemic was nuts, and I swear I was in front of a computer 24/7 trying to get the science and talk to constituents and figure out communication, we weren't meeting. So it was the lowest amount I ever made as mayor. So it truly is a labor of love. A situation I hope to never find myself in again, for sure, but I've certainly grown as a person and as a leader.
Thank you. Yes, I think maybe you had, I don't want to speak for everybody, but you had a tough job during that time, for sure. Dr. Grace, what about you? What about the school community? What did that look like for you?
Well, I think the hardest thing during that time was just navigating and managing everyone else's emotions around some of these topics: masks, no mask, in person, not in person. We offered 4 options to families. And so really the hardest thing to advocate for was just people making the choices that they needed to make regarding their own family, and then making the case for our students and trying to have school in some form or fashion. We were actually open in August on the day we were supposed to open, but we had 4 different options for families. And so we were able to manage that in a way that allowed us to reduce class size, but still gave families lots of options and opportunity, and then had safety precautions in place for our staff. So, just the constant communication, the constant pull on you during that time. But I think the hardest thing really was not so much about the decisions you had to make. You kind of could see the clear path to those. At least I felt like I could, but it was just managing everyone's emotions around those decisions. And they were extremely polarized during that time. I always say about 25% are not for you on any given day when you wake up, and for whatever decision you make, and during the pandemic, during this time, it's been about 50-50. So it was just find the path that you believed was the right thing and stick with it, because you weren't going to get the complete buy-in during this time.
Thank you. James, what about you? What did life look like on behalf of a lobbyist?
Well, I'll give you a early phase pandemic versus a late phase pandemic. Early phase pandemic, it was dollars. A lot of the clients that I represent rely on government funding of some form or fashion. And just the timing of our state budgeting process was very early on when that happened. And our leaders were very conservative with their spending without knowing exactly what the future held. Now that got a whole lot easier in late phase pandemic because our state budget looked pretty decent, and we got a lot of federal aid coming into the state too. But I will also tell you what the easiest thing to lobby for was during the pandemic, and that was loosening of the alcohol regulations. Our state leaders recognized how important those were, so that was a pretty easy one during that time.
And maybe the most important. Just kidding. Thank you, guys. So as leaders in our communities and your communities, you may be faced with difficult decisions that impact individuals, students, businesses, whatever community it is you serve. So what factors do you weigh, and what information do you wish you knew in advance when making decisions this past year? And I'll start with Dr. Grace.
Well, I guess you wished you knew what the end was going to look like, right? When you started out. I think really a lot of what you were trying to do was sort of determine what the spillover effect was going to be of every single decision, because every decision always has some sort of inherent dominoes in there, but they were certainly even more so during this time. So really you're just trying to look at, how does it impact individual families that especially once things open back up and people did have to go to work, and how do you navigate keeping your staff safe, but providing an opportunity for students to be in person so that families can go to work, and so that we continue to educate students, and that you give people the option to be virtual. And so you're just juggling all these things, and you're just not sure about how everything is going to spill over into the next thing. And so what you always wish you knew was more about that spillover effect. And I think we kind of all knew eventually things would get better, but you really didn't know how long that was going to be. So I'm going to leave these folks some time, and I can always come back and add to that.
Thanks. Yeah, absolutely. There was no blueprint, which is really hard. And especially in libraries, I think we have a lot of folks that's our personality types is, we need to know what's the end goal. And it's hard when nobody knows. Mayor Clark, what about you?
So many things. I wish we would have known from the beginning that masks were the way out. I think it could have been a faster recovery. I think that's got to be the biggest one. I've done my very, very best to make data-driven decisions, and there just wasn't any data. And it took a while, and then you had variants. And so I am so tired of living through history, and I'm sure like the world is, but that's got to be it. More on the science. And it was just so many unknowns, and we erred on the side of caution, and some would say too much. But I mean, I will never forget the first time I took the call that somebody had died because of COVID-19 in my community. And if you would have told me that I would have a chance to save lives by making decisions, would have been a little intimidated, and it would have been something that wasn't expected. I remember getting sworn in as mayor and reading the city charter and like joking with my husband, like, oh, look out, honey, I can declare martial law in states of emergency. And lo and behold, I actually had to do that. Ours is still in place until all of the 12 through 15-year-olds have a time to be fully vaccinated. So more about the science. And I want to say thank you to Norman Regional and Dr. Bratzler, the OU Chief COVID Officer, Cleveland County Health Department. It was such a phenomenal collaboration that I hope never goes away, because we've built some bridges that have done some good in Norman.
Thank you. James, anything you'd like to add?
First off, I want to apologize. My camera keeps cutting off. I move up to the unmute button and accidentally slide over the stop video button. So I'm not very good at that. I think for me, as far as making decisions, I typically in my role don't make decisions. I do what my clients want me to do. But the one thing I really wish that I would have had a beat on earlier was what type of aid was coming from the federal government. I think just for planning purposes for both my client and state government in general, that's something that would have been extremely helpful in hindsight. So I hope if this ever happens again, pray to God it doesn't. But if it does, I hope that that's something we can kind of as a collective society be a little bit more, I don't know, forthright with.
Thank you. All right, so over the past year, the landscape has changed drastically for each of you in your roles in various different ways. So I'm curious to know, in our virtual environment that is slowly becoming maybe less of a virtual environment now, what strategies have you or others put into practice that have led to successful advocacy efforts? And James, I'll start with you this time. How has this changed your role, and what strategies have been successful for you in terms of advocacy?
Well, the Library Association had its first ever virtual day at the Capitol, where we had a few representatives pass out pie and then the rest happened online. But I can remember times last session where the Capitol was shut down to visitors, and rightly so. But all of my partners and all of our associates were sitting around different computer screens watching what was happening in various committee meetings or on the floor, and just learning how to quickly text legislators questions I wanted them to ask, or that I had, or information about a bill they were voting on. And so I found myself, for better or worse, way more connected to this thing during the pandemic than otherwise I have been in the past.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you still had that virtual connection, but a lot of the activity at the Capitol was still in person, even more so than a lot of us at home.
It was oddly political too. I knew that if I was walking into a Democrat office, they were going to be wearing a mask, and I was too. If I walked into a Republican office, there's a good chance I wasn't going to be wearing a mask, and they weren't either. And I've never taken so many showers after session, but.
Thanks. Dr. Grace, and you had kind of the opposite experience where, mostly moving to a virtual setting, whereas you're used to that in person. So what would you like to share with us?
Well, again, we had, of course, all of our advocacy and our meetings for associations were all virtual. And I think the really neat part about that was that we learned to better connect with everyone across the state. And the calls I was hosting as president, we had them weekly, and we had 250 school leaders on those calls every week. So what I think is we also learned that there was a need for us to have more ongoing conversation across the state, as opposed to just opportunities for people to come to those face-to-face meetings. So we quickly learned how to connect people across the state to still have some very robust and helpful conversation, which then in turn helped our advocacy efforts, right? Because more people were informed, we had more opportunity for that conversation, for questions back and forth. And we had those meetings once a week for a while, then every other week. And then finally we moved them to like once a month. So I think we learned a lot during that time about the necessity of connecting people virtually from time to time so that we have more voices at the table and we can hear from more people. And I think we found that to be a really useful tool. We all learned about board meetings. I think we all, those of us in the education world, obviously were watching live State Department meetings virtually, as opposed to being there face to face, or not being there and just finding notes later. So I think, while it was a trying time, I think we also learned some things that can be beneficial going forward if we leverage them appropriately. And like Mr. McSpadden, I think we all found ourselves more attached to our cell phones than normal, if that was even possible in my world, but I think it was. And so we just had to continue to navigate those things accordingly. But yeah, we were in a situation where almost all of our meetings were virtual and not face-to-face. And so conferences were virtual, where we were used to face-to-face conferences, they were all virtual. So that was different. So much like this, we were either doing a session live while it was virtual, or we were pre-recording it so that it was available for folks.
Yes, and that's one of the silver linings, that came out of this, is that you all are joining us here today and we're able to reach so many more people because we have that virtual option. So absolutely, we're right there with you. Mayor Clark, anything you would like to add?
I think that we'll be crazy to go back to things as they were, because now that everyone has hopefully mastered, or at least is sufficient in this form of communication, it's opened so many doors. I find it so interesting that we've never been more apart from each other, yet more together all at the same time. So personally, my mayor networks, I had a new mayor's network, the Bloomberg Leadership Program, Women Mayors Network, I had a few, and I can't imagine getting through this crisis without their support. So that human connection was huge in not only my getting through it, but also best practices to help my community get through it. And I love that it is more accessible. You can watch a council meeting on YouTube, which everyone knew, but now we know how to comment online. And so I'm really going to try and keep that accessibility and ease and engagement. Ease for some, so diversity and engagement and diversity and opportunities when we go back to normal, because so many doors have been opened. And again, we'd be crazy to go back exactly the way we used to do it, because that's certainly the past, and crises like pandemics and world wars tend to force social change in a variety of ways, and we're literally looking at one of them. Same thing with my actual job that pays me. We've had conferences as well, and it opened up so many doors for speakers because the logistics of travel was no longer an issue. And frankly, I'm a big fan of not jumping in my car and going to meeting to meeting to meeting to meeting. And so it's almost a green impact on the environment as well. So many benefits to being flexible and how we communicate going forward.
Absolutely. And speaking of engagement, that was a great segue into our next question. So how do you see libraries being at the table when discussing crucial topics? Just to name a few: economic recovery, civic engagement, that social engagement. We'll start with Dr. Grace.
Well, I think there are lots of ways for libraries to be at the table. Libraries do a great job of educating a community if we're talking about our public libraries, and they host a lot of opportunities for folks to come in, whether it's virtually or in person. Same thing within our school environment. They extend the classroom walls and they're able to add to the work that's done there. And so I think, really for us, it's going to be looking at how we help how libraries can help navigate some of those conversations and create the opportunity for those conversations to happen, which I think we see as a really important part of things that need to happen right now, just all across our state and in our communities, just that ongoing conversation, opportunity for engagement, conversation. And libraries do a great job at that. They've done it before the pandemic. And I think now we just have new ways to do it and newer and different conversations to have. And so I think we'll see them continue to do that, host all of those various opportunities that they normally do.
Great, thanks. James, what about you? Where do you see opportunity for us getting players?
I think the most tangible, we talked about broadband earlier, and all over rural Oklahoma, you can pull up and see people parked in parking lots after hours of libraries just to get on their Wi-Fi. You have people who were probably forced out of work due to the pandemic coming in and getting help with their resumes to try to get back into the workforce. You have kids who are out of in-person school for a year who probably fell behind in reading, doing summer reading programs like my kids are going to do. To try to get caught back up and ready for the next grade level. So it's, when you start thinking about it, I think a tougher question would be, where aren't libraries at the table?
Love it. So powerful. Mayor Clark?
I think libraries are going to, all of the things that have been mentioned, but for me, I love the comments about how masking was political, which is just a shame, because public health should never be political, yet the US completely botched that one from the beginning. But yay, vaccines, we're coming back in the end. But it exacerbated a political divide that was already there. And we are apparently unable to talk to each other anymore. And being unable to be in the same physical space didn't help that either. And so I'm already partnering with the libraries on different programming ideas to help facilitate constructive dialogue. Because I always see libraries as a not political place, as a safe place to have important community conversations that often deal with diversity and inclusivity. So I hope that our libraries take a role there in trying to rebuild these bridges as we learn how to socialize generally, but also to come together. We have more in common than we don't. And I think libraries are a wonderful place to help us remember that.
Thank you, Mayor Clark. And I'm going to pay you later because you had a great segue into our last question. Given that increase in polarity in today's political environment that you were just talking about, how do you encourage all of us to reach out to our community leaders and elected officials, both when we agree and when our opinions don't align? We touched on that earlier of, speaking up for what you're for, not just what you're against, but how would you advise people to take that step and to start those conversations and facilitate those conversations, both with libraries and then people that we serve? I'll start with James. You want to go first?
Sure. I guess the one thing I'd ask is just be nice. There's really good people on both sides of the aisle. In the last calendar year, I've seen my friends on the left get death threats. I've seen my friends on the right get the same. And just a nice civil conversation can go such a long way. And I think that's the one ask I would have here.
Absolutely. Dr. Grace, what about you?
Yeah, I think just never forgetting that kindness does matter and that it really goes a long way. And I think back to the point that we all talked about earlier, that there's really no substitute for relationships. And so you really have to start those relationships early and make them ongoing. And that sometimes we do just have to agree to disagree, but that we can do that in a civil manner, and that we can still be kind at the end of the day and still recognize the humanity in one another. And that really, as Mayor Clark mentioned a minute ago, that we really do have a lot more in common than we do differences when you get right down to it. And sometimes we just focus so much on the differences. So continue to build those relationships, and both during in session and out of session. That's what I'd say.
Yeah, we talk a lot about the deposits and withdrawals of relationships, and you need to make sure you're doing both equally. So that's great. Thank you for that. Mayor Clark, wrap us up.
I don't have much to add to that. Be nice is number one. I've had messages and emails and threats that never in my lifetime would I imagine that somebody would take time out of their day to send to me. And it's because we didn't agree. And I firmly believe none of this would be said to my face, but that doesn't take away the just complete incivility of how we treated each other. And we're better than that. And we are neighbors. And usually a crisis brings people together, whereas in this case, it didn't, unfortunately. So definitely rebuild those relationships and redefine them, because what, again, was in the past will not be what is the future. And change is hard, but always find common ground. I tend to start with sports and food. That's a tip right there. Good place to connect with people. But we, as I said earlier, we have more in common than we don't. And it's okay to disagree, but we've lost the ability to have constructive dialogue. There are members of my council that people are shocked to know that we'll go get a drink after a meeting. And they're like, really? You're so tough on the dais. Well, yeah, because we're on the dais, but that's not how we are to each other all the time. And people are just mind blown by that. So it's gotten way out of hand. And we've seen the environment of national government, the federal level, trickle down, and I think hurt local government. But here it gets so personal, because you run into me at the grocery store and I get to hear about how your trash wasn't picked up on time. I can't go to my kid's baseball game without hearing about how we need to improve certain things, which is fine. But I think it makes it a little more scary, and it cuts a little deeper, because these are your neighbors saying these things to you. So just remember our humanity, and we can bounce back, but some things that you say, type, or send will be there forever. And I just think we need to remember that.
Absolutely. Thank you all. We do have a few minutes left, so not to put you on the spot, but if you had one piece of advice on how to advocate effectively in our new world, I think we all agree we're not getting back to a normal. I think that has passed, but if there's one last thing you wanted to share with our attendees that you haven't gotten to say, or maybe there was a question you had hoped we had asked, is there any last parting words you'd like to share with our attendees?
I'll throw out, clearly I'm a big advocate for bringing in the diversity of kinds of communication, including the virtual, but don't forget about the in-person ones. Don't forget about a handwritten letter. And I think those are very powerful as well. And if you truly want to be a successful advocate or even just involved in your community, you have to do all of them. Because some people still only read newspapers. Some people aren't on social media. My grandma works on Zoom, but it's a challenge. So, but then if I write a handwritten letter, I've gotten thank yous for my thank you notes, which I always find interesting. So while we're adding to our toolbox of communication, don't forget the old school stuff. That would be my tip.
I love that. And who doesn't love mail anyway? That's like from a real human, not just spams.
Kind of in the same vein, with everything moving to be more online and digital in this new world, it reminds me of a quote by one of my favorite authors, Neil Gaiman, when he said, "Google can bring you back 100,000 answers, but a librarian will bring you back the right one." Those are my parting words.
You've got all the good buzzwords for librarians today. Love it. No, that's great. Dr. Grace?
Love that. I love that, James. That's one of the best ones I've heard in a long time. And that's great. The librarians will love that. I think, as Mayor Clark said, I'm a big believer in handwritten thank you notes. I think it makes a big difference. We're in such a time in society where everything's quick and immediate, and a text or an email is really easy and convenient. But the art of writing that handwritten note seems to be a little lost at times. And so I think it makes a big difference. Getting in a room with people when it's appropriate makes a difference too. Again, back to those relationships. I think never underestimate those relationships and whatever it takes to build those. And remember that the relationship has to be built different with different people, that everybody has a different way that you connect with them, that we don't all connect in the same way, and different things are meaningful to different people. And so kind of trying to find what those things are as we connect with people. I love, one of my favorite quotes is the Helen Keller quote that says, "Alone we can do so little, but together we can do so much." And so I think just remembering that it really takes all of us as Oklahomans, as librarians, as educators, as public servants, as lobbyists, whoever we are, that it takes really all of us together to make Oklahoma the best place to live.
Absolutely. Couldn't have put it better myself. Well, thank you all for sharing your expertise. And I just want to say congratulations to you all for continuing your great work over this past year. And I know you faced a number of challenges, but I also know that you all killed it, and you will continue to accomplish great things over the next year and years to come. So thank you all for being here and sharing your expertise with our attendees. And I have to do some housekeeping. All of you participants, please be sure to complete your evaluation for this session. And thanks to Folio for sponsoring this. And again, thank you guys for your time. I know you're all very busy, so thank you for preparing for this and being here today and spending time with us. So thank you so much.